event. Dear friends and colleagues, I'm happy to welcome Professor Sebastian Luft from Marquette University, Milwaukee, United States, who friendly accepted to give a talk within our series of lecture on the topic, what is phenomenology? Sebastian Luft is a famous researcher in phenomenology, published a number of important articles. I will mention only the books which were published in the last 2 decades. So Husserl, Die Konstitution der Lebenswelt, then Phenomenologie der Phänomenologie, a book that every researcher which works on phenomenological method has on his or her shelf. Subjectivity and Life World in Transcendental Phenomenology, the Space of Culture towards the Transcendental Philosophy of Culture, Meditaciones Phenomenológicas y Neokantianas, and Philosophie Lehren. Without further interruption, I happily give word to you, Professor Luft, please.
Добрый вечер. Спасибо за приглашение. Я рад быть здесь, чтобы прочитать лекцию о феноменологии. And my Russian ends here. Thank you very much, Georgi, for the friendly introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. You all have the handout, so I will not read off a prepared lecture. What I'm going to do is just speak freely and using the outline as a general guiding thread that will lead me through. What I'm going to do is very introductory, so I hope you will not feel bored or feel disrespected for being too easy. But of course, the problems only begin once one gets deeper. So as for introduction, I will just mention the main figures of classical phenomenology. And of course, if we talk about phenomenology, we are of course talking about a movement that is ongoing still and still active, with many people working actively in this area, to mention only someone like Dan Zahavi in Copenhagen and other people. But the classical figures are clearly Franz Brentano, Edmund Husserl, Max Scheler, Martin Heidegger, and of course, not to forget very important women phenomenologists such as Edith Stein and Gerda Walter. I'm especially a fan of Gerda Walter, who's probably least known of these figures. Her book on the social ontology of communities is a book that she wrote in 1922. And has been just published, translated into English by myself. So a little advertisement here, will come out next year. I think it's a very important book on social ontology, which is, by the way, a very important topic today. You will notice that, especially the beginnings, Franz Brentano and Edmund Husserl, of course, came from what is now Austria. Brentano was German, but he became famous as a professor in Vienna. Husserl came from Moravia, which is now a Czech territory, then part of the KUK monarchy. So there's a sense in which some people have made the case that there's sort of Austrian origins to phenomenology, meaning essentially a very realistic approach to the world. And that also meant a distancing from the transcendental tradition that was dominant in the German country, such as the Kant himself, of course, but also the whole tradition of German idealism, Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, and also at the time, the dominant philosophers in the German-speaking countries were the Neo-Kantians. So in a sense, phenomenology started out as an opposition to the Kantian tradition. And the main idea was to get a clear sense of the world, a realistic picture of the world without too much speculation. So the anti-speculative bent turned out to be the first opening move, if you will, of phenomenology. So these were the main figures. Each of them you could treat on their own. What I'm trying to do is basically lay out some main themes of phenomenology that I think are dominant themes for everybody doing phenomenology. So I'm not claiming to make a special interpretation here, but I'm trying to just lay out what I think are the main topics and, if you will, philosophical commitments that everybody who identifies as a phenomenologist would have to adhere to. So the first one, I mean, there's many themes that one could mention. I'll just mention what I think are the most important ones. So number one, intentionality. So the basic idea, and it comes from Brentano, and Brentano, of course, in turn was a scholastic. In many ways, he's influenced by scholastic philosophy and Aristotle. And he takes up a theme from the scholastic tradition and develops it, and that is the idea of the intentionality of consciousness. Intentionality is a very technical term. It does not refer to the way in which we ordinarily use the term to say, I intentionally hit somebody, meaning deliberately or with intention. But intentionality is a constitutive term, meaning that there is a fundamental connection between the mind and the world. And this intentionality is that consciousness is always conscious of something. Sounds very trivial, but of course, if you unpack the notion, it becomes very complex. So the idea is that consciousness is always of something, and this of something is not anything without its being conscious to a creature that has consciousness. So intentionality and consciousness is not something exclusive to the human being. Of course, animals also have intentionality, right? They're also conscious of something. I mean, when a dog sees its owner or sees some food and desires to eat it, of course, that's also a form of intentionality. And that means for the term consciousness, that it is also a very, very broad term, right? So the word Bewusstsein that the German speakers use, consciousness, is a very technical term that just means, again, a very maximally open notion of awareness of something, okay? So intentionality comes in many shapes and forms. So if I think of numbers, I intend numbers. Numbers are given to me. But if I look at a tree, this tree is also given to me in my consciousness. If I feel the glasses on my nose, right, this is a form of intentionality as well. If I feel a pain in my stomach because I've eaten something bad, that's also a form of intentionality. If I desire to have a cup of tea, that feeling of desire for wanting to have a tea is a form of intentionality. If I will that I would like to, ask my student to get me a book from the library, if I will this, that is also a form of intentionality. If I have a feeling of anxiety, for example, or a feeling of joy, right? That what I'm enjoying, or that what the joy is the joy of, so the joy over this splendid cup of tea, is also a form of intentionality. Now, that means that if phenomenology is an investigation of intentionality, which it is, so it is a logos of phenomena, of the way in which objects are given to me, to my consciousness in the form of intentionality, it means this is a big research program, right? Phenomenology becomes a research program of, formally speaking, an investigation into all possible forms of consciousness and what is given in consciousness, okay? So it becomes a huge research theme in which the investigation has to be about forms of consciousness, forms of intentionality, and that which is given in the intention, in the intentional act, okay? So if I take something like external perception, right? So seeing a tree is an investigation of its own merit. So if I mean, just to mention very formal, simple things, extended objects, I mean, take the cell phone, right? I mean, if I see the cell phone from one side, the back side is hidden to me, right? And if I turn it around and I see the front side, then the back side is hidden to me, okay? So this is a very simple description that is to indicate that external objects have, and Husserl calls this Abschattungen, adumbrations. In other words, external three-dimensional objects in external perception, visual perception in this case, have a givenness that is not complete, right? I see the front side, I anticipate the back side. The back side is not given, but it is co-given, right? So if I see a tree, I don't think this tree is just a two-dimensional thing. I think the tree, I think, and this is not a reflective thinking, this is something that goes on automatically, as it were, that the tree has a three-dimensional shape and that I only see the front side facing me, and that there's co-given sides that are not given, okay? So the description of the intentionality of external perception is to say, three-dimensional objects give themselves an adumbrations. And this is a necessary law for any creature that has visual perception. So it's not just about the human being, right? Every animal that has visual perception, even God, Husserl says, if God has something like visual perception, can also only see objects as given in adumbrations. Can contrast that to hearing a melody, all right? If I hear a melody, the melody is audible as a melody only in a temporal sequence, okay? So can I speak of adumbrations of melodies? Can I say that there's a backside to the melody, to the audible experience? No, there cannot be, right? So if I want to describe audible phenomena, the description becomes very different, right? There is something analogous, perhaps. So the tree, seeing the tree also has a temporal sequence of me walking around it, for instance, right? Also has a temporal sequence. But it is very different from hearing a melody, right? So there's something like a consciousness of time in consciousness, as part of consciousness, that is that is essential for being able to hear something like temporally extended things, right? So there also has to be the sense in which my experience is not just temporally located to like one single second, but to hear a melody as a melody and not just as discrete tones, I must be able to somehow synthesize these extended tones into something like a melody. Or take you hearing right now me speak a meaningful English sentence, to hear the sentence as a meaningful sentence, as a semantic whole, you also have to have some kind of extension in your consciousness to be able to hear the sentence as a coherent English grammatically correct sentence, okay? So this goes to the idea then of regions of consciousness. So phenomenology, in the broadest term, is a descriptive discipline of intentionality in all different forms of consciousness, right? So it's a big research project, and Husserl himself said, I'm just the pioneer, I'm just the beginning. He compares phenomena, the sphere of phenomenology, he compares that with a new continent, right? A new continent, I mean, he was probably thinking of something like North America, right? I mean, the settlers come over and they don't even know what the continent looks like, right? I mean, so as slowly as the American continent was discovered and mapped, that's sort of the way in which Husserl thought of himself as doing phenomenology. It's a research project. He's the Columbus, so to speak, who discovers the new world, but then there must be researchers following him who follow the research program and map the continent, okay? So the idea is that this is a research project that is not the same as psychology, right? I mean, you could say, well, isn't this just a form of psychology to describe consciousness? Yes and no, right? I mean, it is psychological in the sense that we're talking about phenomena given to consciousness, but we're not talking about consciousness of the human being, which would be an empirical discipline. We're talking about an a priori discipline. And we're also talking about a very different type of mapping than we would do in the case of something like empirical sciences, where part of a study of the human being would be the human being's psyche, but also the human being's body, right? So regions in the world, right? Physical regions that are studied by certain disciplines, so chemistry, physics, biology, history, anthropology, for example, we don't have the same structure on the side of consciousness, right? So we must be without presuppositions when we try to do this mapping, because the sphere of consciousness, the continent of consciousness, is very different from the continent that is studied by the empirical sciences. So the basic difference between the normal sciences and phenomenology is that the normal sciences study things in the world, and phenomenology studies our consciousness of things in the world. Okay, so that is very different. And the main difference is, apart from the difference in mapping, is that in the sciences, we're talking about things in the world. In other words, things that exist apart from experiencing consciousness, right? So if a biologist studies a certain species of animals, she will not be concerned with her experience of the animal, but it's about the animal itself, okay? In other words, the study of the certain species of animal will be a study that can be assessed by anybody if this research is written down as a book, for example, right? And that means it is a study, you could say, with Thomas Nagel's distinction from the third person perspective, right? So the study of this animal species has nothing to do with the research experience of it. However, in phenomenology, it is precisely the opposite, because precisely the experience of the phenomenon is precisely the starting point, right? So it is a science from the first person perspective. And that means then that this study has regions that must be studied as well. So the region of external perception. And within external perception, we can talk about visual perception, I just talked about, as an example, auditory perception, and perhaps haptic perception, and so on, right? Again, this has nothing to do with the senses that we have, but it has to do with our way of experiencing the world through different types of sensibility. But there are also other regions of consciousness that are very different. So, for example, the consciousness of images. So what is it when I imagine certain objects, right? So how does imagination work, right? How is it possible that I'm able to experience or imagine a unicorn, right? Which is not anywhere in the world. What is the unicorn a phenomenon of, right? Does it refer to anything external to my imagination of it? Time consciousness is another region that I just gave an example of, right? So that every experience also takes place in a temporal stream. And so the stream of temporal experience is very different from the time that I measure on the watch, right? Another sphere would be recollection, right? So how is it possible that I recollect something, right? So what is the phenomenology of a recollection, right? So if I recollect right now my conversation with my friend yesterday, what is the content of that recollection, right? So is it the words that he spoke, or the fact that, is it the coffee that we drank together, or is it my experience of, my recollection of the fact of us having drunk coffee together, right? So these are very different regions. And that means then, once you have done a certain mapping of the continent of consciousness, the question becomes, how do these things relate to each other, right? How are the different phenomena of consciousness, regions of consciousness related, okay? And Husserl's idea, and again, here is where the disagreement begins between Husserl and other phenomenologists. The idea is that the main species, if you will, of consciousness are normal consciousness, where it is merely taking in information about the world. And then we have forms in which we react to the world. Husserl calls those spheres, and he gets this from Brentano, by the way, emotion, so normal perception, emotion, and willing, okay? So there is a form of emotive consciousness that, again, has its own sui generis laws. So if I have a visceral hatred of something or somebody, right? This too is a form of consciousness, so hating somebody, right? So if I have a very visceral hate of somebody, that if I see this person, I get red in the face and my blood pressure rises, you know, sort of this kind of emotional reaction. It's very different from just seeing this person, right? So I walk out in the hallway right here. A colleague comes walking towards my way, somebody I don't like very much. I start having a negative emotion, or maybe a positive emotion with respect to them. And Husserl's idea is that I can only have an act of hatred, or any emotive act, based on simple, normal consciousness, right? So very simply speaking, I cannot hate something that I don't see, okay? And Husserl captures this in what he calls founding relations, right? So the idea is that we're talking still about the ways in which spheres of consciousness relate to each other, right? And his idea is that in some cases, forms of experience come together, are sort of mixed together, right? So every experience takes place in temporal flow. That's sort of obvious, right? So temporality is a form of consciousness which I can isolate and analyze directly and discretely, but of course, every experience takes place in the temporal stream. So that's sort of intermingled with every act. But I can also extract and isolate acts of hatred and acts of willing, or emotive acts and willing acts. But the idea, again, that Husserl has is that every emotive act is founded upon, rests upon a normal perceptive act. Okay, so sometimes in this particular example, emotive acts are founded upon normal perceptive acts. That's a law of consciousness. Now, of course, in normal experience, in normal life, these things go together, right? So, I mean, I go out to the hallway, I see a colleague, I'm pleasantly surprised to see her. I have a question with her. Oh, now that I see you, can I ask you something? I meant to ask you. So I have an act of interrogating, right? So these things all go together. And, based on the reaction I get from my colleague, I'm either happy or pleased or satisfied or disappointed. Again, disappointment would be an emotive act based on the fact that I hear something from her which I don't like, for example, right? She tells me, no, I didn't have time to read your piece. I'm very sorry. And I feel disappointed. That's an act that's founded upon, in this case, act of hearing. So the disagreement here is in the sense that phenomenologists disagree on what the priority is, right? So, for example, Scheler in his phenomenology seems to think that our first and primary access to the world is in fact emotive, and that acts like normal seeing and perceiving are founded upon emotive acts and not vice versa. So Scheler wants to turn around this hierarchy. Someone like Heidegger, if Heidegger talks about fundamental moods such as anxiety, also seems to be contributing to this discussion by saying that the primary access to the world is not in terms of intentional acts or individual acts, but rather moods which disclose the possibility, the space for having certain experience, okay? So my point here is that when Scheler and Heidegger disagree with Husserl on the founding relations, they are still having a productive, fruitful discussion, right? So I don't see someone like Heidegger fundamentally disagreeing or rejecting Husserl's proposal, but rather trying to work with it and develop it in a certain way in which the general agreement is that there are founding relations, and we just have to figure out what the correct founding relations are. So in this sense, I see all phenomenologists, all classical phenomenologists agree that there is something like intentionality as a study of consciousness, that phenomenology is defined by this study of intentionality. but the disagreement begins with the way in which the continent may be mapped and the way in which relations between different spheres of consciousness are described. So in this sense, I see all phenomenologists having a fundamental agreement in this sense. The disagreement goes further, however, in the last point of the main themes, and that is phenomenology as first philosophy. And it's here that this is really Husserl's project alone. I don't see any of the other phenomenologists following him here. And the idea here is that this is already something that begins in the logical investigations and is continued later then, that if our access to the world is the first for us, right? And if we have access to the world, are we able to study things in the world? So going back to the idea of sciences of the first person perspective, sciences of the third person perspective. So biology, chemistry, history are all studies of the third person perspective. But if our access to the world is the first thing for us, so we couldn't study chemistry if we didn't have access to chemical phenomena, quite simply speaking, then phenomenology is first philosophy. It is founding in the sense, it founds the other sciences in the sense that it comes logically, not temporally first, and that it is founding for others. So in this sense, Husserl is a Cartesian, and this again, has been met with criticism on the part of his followers, in that all sciences are ultimately founded on the foundation, which is the philosophy or the study of the access to the world. And in terms of logical order, this is the first, and that's why phenomenology is first philosophy. And again, most phenomenologists after Husserl have seen him here as fundamentally breaking or contradicting his otherwise normal insight that phenomenology should just be a study of the world as it is experienced. And that's why the break within phenomenology happens here when Husserl insists on the fact that phenomenology should be a founding fundamental discipline for others, rather than saying, to be more modest, phenomenology is just a study of phenomena, in other words, giving us access to a whole new region or continent, again, to speak in the geographical metaphor of another aspect of the world that would otherwise go missing. And if we could be deflationary with respect to the ambition of phenomenology, then it would just be sort of a complement to other scientific disciplines. But no, for Husserl, it was more than that. It was a fundamental, founding, grounding discipline for all others. Okay, how does this cashed out? Well, let me move to the second section and then, sort of come to a conclusion, is that Husserl also calls this phenomenology transcendental empiricism. And that, of course, is a clear contradictio in adjecto for any Kantian, as you know. And here's how he means this. And this is how sort of another sense in which we can understand phenomenology as perhaps first or as a transcendental philosophy. And that starts out if we talk about the way we normally experience the world, right? So if you go out in the street and ask somebody, what do you see? And they will say, I see a tree, or I see a car, or I will see another human being. And this other human being is a woman or a man, or perhaps I could be mistaking it with a mannequin in a shop window, and so on. So if one were to ask, is it about what you see, or is it about what you see, or is it about your seeing of what you see? In other words, does it depend on the subjective experience of what you see to be able to see what you see? And every normal person on the street would say, no, I see a tree, I see a car, right? So in other words, in our normal lives, and Husserl thinks also for every scientist, the access problem to the world is not relevant. And he calls that the natural attitude. We live in the natural attitude, and also the scientists live in the natural attitude. And the natural attitude means many things, but it means, most importantly, perhaps, that our access to the world is not thematized in the natural attitude. So we don't say it is, I see that I see a tree, you see a tree, right? So the subjective contribution to being able to see what you see is not part of the natural attitude, and it doesn't have to be. So if I want to talk about the phenomena of phenomenology, I have to make a radical break with the natural attitude, okay? And the phenomenologist thematizes precisely that which is in the natural attitude, never a theme, okay? It's a radical reflective break with the normal way, ordinary way of living, okay? So if you think of Hegel's idea that the philosophy is the world upside down, it's a little bit like that in Husserl as well. So phenomenology enters a new sphere. And here Husserl uses another metaphor that is different from the continent, the geographical metaphor. He used the language of second and third dimension, right? So if the whole world as understood and cognized and experienced in the natural attitude can be compared to a two-dimensional world. And phenomenology breaks through into the third dimension. It is a dimension that is not seen if you are a creature of flatland. I mean, he gets this idea from Helmholtz, and Helmholtz in turn gets it from, I have an article somewhere where I talk about this historical background. So there's a novel written in Britain in the 17th or 18th century about flatland creatures, point creatures, flatland creatures. And so the idea is that, you know, we are all creatures of flatland, of a two-dimensional world, and phenomenology opens up a third dimension into the depth of the and so this third dimension is not something that is ever seen for people on flatland, the flatland creatures that all of us are in the natural attitude. So in this sense, it gives us a whole new dimension of experience. And this whole new dimension is exactly, again, consciousness in its intentional knowing of the world. And so the phenomenologist talks about something that the person in the natural attitude never experiences. The person in normal experience always talks about the world out there. And the third dimension gives us the idea that what the world is always only the world as it is experienced. And the way we experience the world is, of course, the way the world is for us, right? So because we have the certain visual perception that we have things given to us in adumbrations. So it's by virtue of our physical makeup that we have two eyes, right? Or this type of vision that we're able to see the world as the way we see it normally. And so the idea is that this is transcendental idealism, right? In the Kantian sense. So this is the transcendental turn that Husserl takes. Phenomenology studies the conditions of the possibility of experiencing things in the world. So it is a whole different study than the way in which things are normally experienced. And the transcendental stance is the stance that says the world is nothing for us if it is not an object of experience. We know nothing about the world as it really is. Whereas the person in the natural attitude can be compared to a transcendental realist, an empirical realist. The person in the natural attitude believes that the world exists naively, right? Exists even if no subject would experience it. And that's why the natural attitude is also naive, right? It is philosophically naive in thinking that we can know anything about the world without our access in the way in which we have access to the world, okay? So transcendental empiricism is then a term, an apt term for phenomenology insofar as it is a study of the different regions of consciousness in the way in which these regions make it possible, to use that transcendental language, the conditions of the possibility of experiencing things as visual or as auditory, or as objects of reflection, or as objects of recollection or imagination, and so on. So again, this is the full maturity of Husserl's philosophical position as a transcendental idealism, right? That transcendental idealism is the stance that is reached with the break from the natural attitude, and it studies the conditions of the possibility of the experience of the world, which this whole third dimension, which the person in natural attitude living in flatland never has any experience of. Now, if we study consciousness in the way in which it gives us or allows us or gives us conditions of the possibility to experience the world, then we must also understand essentially two more dimensions. Number one, that we are not alone in the world, right? So we're always with others, so that my consciousness is always informed by people who have lived before me, my tradition, my parents, right? My family, my country, my historical history as a German, as an American, as a Russian. Of course, those are empirical facts, but of course, everything empirical stands under eidetic laws. So consciousness has a structure that is both historically thick, right? Because like right now, I'm speaking to you via Zoom, right? With a technical device that's highly complicated, highly complex. So, you know, something like the invention of the internet has its own history. And of course, it's a history of, again, if you talk about technology, you can talk about, well, the development of the internet as a certain technological development in the history of the world, beginning in the 1970s or something. But we can also talk about the internet as a phenomenon of human interaction, right? As a form in which we are intersubjective, right? So right now I'm, you know, amazingly connected over what, 6,000 kilometers or more in real time to be able to share, have a common experience, right? And so all of you, insofar as you follow me, are thinking about the same things, you're also in the sense having the same experience, right? We are sharing thoughts, right? Or I'm sharing my thoughts with you, and I hope you share your thoughts with me later. And I would be nothing on my own, right? So every single consciousness that I have has its history, right? In the sense that seeing has its own history, right? And also in the sense in which all experience, insofar as it is meaningful, is shared with others, right? I cannot, I mean, just like Wittgenstein says, I cannot have a private language. There is nothing private in the world. In the world of consciousness, in the world of shared meaning, nothing is private, and all meaning is shared, right? I mean, there is no such thing as a private meaning, or if it is, I would be suffering from the severe impairment of consciousness. So phenomenology studies then consciousness in this thick and broad dimension of being static. Right now, I'm talking to you, this is static, but also the static consciousness right now rests on a depth dimension of what Husserl calls genesis, and also has an intersubjective dimension insofar as consciousness is always shared consciousness. And finally, the world then is, what I experience of the world is not just individual things, but right now, I mean, if you look at my screen, you will see that I'm in my office surrounded by my books and by my working environment. Things, in other words, enable me to work. You'll see that if you look at me, you don't just see my face. You might see my face primarily, but you see my face immersed in my office, in my work study space, right? With my computer and my pictures that remind me of friends and so on. And so the world, in other words, is not just a world of things, but is a context. It's a horizontal structure, which the late Husserl then calls the life world, right? So phenomenology is a study of consciousness as experiencing not just individual things, but things as embedded in contexts. And this context is nothing in the context of all contexts is the life world. And of course, the life world itself has a historical dimension. Okay, so the life world is not the same as nature, right? But the life world is the world insofar as it is experienced as meaningful. And of course, this life world then breaks down into individual sub-contexts, if you will, right? So the life world right now of my office is very different from when I later go to a restaurant and have dinner with friends and talk about our working day and our week. Is a very different context. And again, is a very different context from when I go to the forest and take a walk. And again, the forest then is not experienced as pure nature, but as something that I find aesthetically pleasing, or something that gives me relaxation from my workday. And again, it's very different from when I go to a football game and am there with my friends and cheer for my team. That again is a different, if you will, social context that is very different, has its own rules that are very different from the way I conduct myself here in the workspace, right? So that's why it's always weird when, students know me the way I am right now. And then I see students, if I'm running, taking a run by the lake here, which is very beautiful, looking like, somebody who does sports. So, people sometimes, are sort of surprised to see a professor being a normal person. Well, but that's because we are always already in different contexts, okay? And so the study then of these worlds in which we are as human beings has been called by Husserl and then following Edith Stein and Gerda Walter social ontology, right? So phenomenology has as one of its, if you will, sub disciplines, the discipline of social ontology, which studies the way in which we experience the world as communal beings, right? So that the fact that we're always somehow connected with others, that our actions and our activities are always informed by others, have a certain meaning that is necessarily intersubjective, right? If I form a club to read Shakespeare, right? I mean, this is a social activity that I do with others, has its own rules and regulations, which are very different from the way in which I am a member of a family or a member of a philosophical faculty in which we have to make decisions about how to reform our study disciplines, for example, right? So this is the study then of the world as a life world, as a shared world, and that has been called social ontology, which has become sort of a new discipline today, insofar as it is studied not just by phenomenologists, but it is something that already Husserl and especially Gerda Walter talked about exactly 100 years ago. So let me just provide a quick outlook. I've spoken for 45 minutes now, I see, so I'm about to wrap it up to not press your patience longer. That phenomenology today, of course, has its own history. So we're now at the time where we can write the history of phenomenology itself as a phenomenon of Western and worldwide philosophy. Phenomenology has been dominant, I would say, on the European continent, at least in Europe, since about 1900, when Husserl came on the scene. Of course, then you have World War II and many phenomenologists going into diaspora, either being killed or having been forced to go into different countries. So there's a big influence coming from European phenomenology to the United States and Canada, North America, in other words, and South America too, as of World War II and afterwards. And so it's still a very strong movement. I think in Russia it is also quite strong, but I'm not quite sure. I hope maybe we can talk about this. And of course, that has changed phenomenology. So first of all, as a social phenomenon, it has become a part of a global enterprise, you could say. It is represented in every country of the world. But it also had to compete, especially in North America, in the 20th century, the second half of the 20th century, with the other dominant stream that came over from Europe, and that is analytic philosophy. So at least in North America, for the last 50 years, between 1950 and 2000 perhaps, so for the latter half of the century, Analytic philosophy was the clear dominant philosophical paradigm, coming, of course, from England, Russell, Wittgenstein, and those philosophers, and has become sort of its own breed of philosophy. And phenomenology has been identified more or less with so-called continental philosophy, the philosophy coming from the European continent. So not just Husserl, Heidegger, but also the Frankfurt School, essentially, and of course France, Foucault, and these thinkers as well, Derrida. But in the last 20 years or so, there has been sort of a softening of what used to be two very distinct philosophical schools that had very little to do with each other. And now sort of everything's becoming softened up. People talk about post-split philosophy, in other words, beyond the split between the continentalists and the analytics. And I welcome this. I personally think it's a good thing. I never think it's a good thing in philosophy to have closed off, have a closed off mindset. That's not a philosophical stance for me. And so I think today phenomenology has become strong again. I mean, there were always people who studied Husserl and Heidegger and others, but it has become strong again in the sense that now many philosophers from other traditions are borrowing or taking up the phenomenological method. So cognitive sciences, for example, many of them practice what they call the phenomenological method of first-person experience. In psychology and psychopathology, it's become an important field. But also in something like, again, I mentioned social ontology. Social ontology is a discipline that is practiced for the most part by people who do not know much about Husserl and Edith Stein and Gerda Walter. But of course, the themes they work on and some figures of thought that they utilize and use stem from classical phenomenology. And so in this sense, people are now returning to many texts in classical phenomenology that have been forgotten, and in the case of someone like Husserl, are still being received because they have been published only in the last 10, 15 years. So the reception historically and exegetically of Husserl and these figures is not finished, but it should and can and will be done also not for the sake of exegesis alone to understand Husserl himself, but to understand how these things, these thoughts can be used for contemporary philosophy. And I think I'll stop here. Spasiba. So I don't know how we want to proceed.
Yeah, dear Professor Luft, thank you very much for the lecture. So now we open the discussion. Please, dear students, I will insist that master students ask their question first, and then some colleagues also will join. So please, Yelena Klemenskaya, your question, please.
I'm all ears.
Sorry, that just was rounded of close, and I'm just trying to pose the question. Maybe someone can do it first, and I will ask it in the second time. Okay.
Sure. Anastasia has her hand up.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for the lecture.
Of course.
I wanted to ask a question regarding the address to the reduction. Yes, that is one of the basics of phenomenology, and apparently there are different approaches to it inside the phenomenology movement. Yes, so for example, Schelle kind of leads us to anthropological true being dimension, meaning that the giving us hints that the natural attitude could be overcome like totally. At the same time, Merleau-Ponty talks about the infinite process of the reduction, and the reduction that can't be finished at all. So it seems to be that Merleau-Ponty's approach is considered more phenomenological, because it does not give that much of this metaphysics basis. So at the same time, the modern world, the modern science seems to be founded in the classical metaphysics and wants to have something final. So my question is how this concept of the infinity, and it's not only the reduction, but maybe in other regions as well, how does this coexist or influences other dimensions of modern knowledge? What does phenomenology brings to the table? Thank you.
Okay, yeah, that's a great question. Very open-ended question. I didn't mention the reduction explicitly when I talked about Husserl, but I mean, of course, for Husserl, the reduction means the break with a natural attitude, right? So it's this radical break with the ordinary way of seeing the world, right? That's Husserl's idea. And so there's different reductions, but just to stay with the transcendental reduction is the reduction to pure consciousness, right? And in this sense, the word reduction is a very misleading term because it doesn't mean in the way which the word reductionism today is used, to be reductive, no, but to lead back, reduce, right? That's the meaning of the word in which Husserl uses it. Now, Merleau-Ponty has this idea that as you said, the reduction can never be completed, right? It's an infinite thing. And I think and people then sort of pitch that against Husserl to see that as a big rejection of Husserl. I don't see it that way. I think it's a bit of a misunderstanding, right? So for Merleau-Ponty, what does he mean by that? And what he means by that is that the reduction can never be complete, is that we can never be a pure ego, right? That we can never be reduced to complete purity of consciousness, right? And one of the reasons we can't do that for Merleau-Ponty is because we have a body, right? Our bodies always our anchor in the world, right? We can never reduce the body to something like pure consciousness. And in this sense, the incompleteness of the reduction means that we always have to keep in mind that we always are in the world. We are never, we're never outside of the world. And that, if that's meant to be a critique of Husserl, I find that a misunderstanding of Husserl, right? Husserl also says we have a lived body. He's the first one to bring up the topic of the Leib, right? Which is translated in English as a lived body, as opposed to a mere body, like a physical body. Or I can also study the body as a physical object, right? I go to the doctor later and my doctor's going to look at my hand, things, if everything functions right. So he doesn't look at me as a Leib, he looks at me as a body that functions or not with correct blood value. I have cholesterol too high and blah, blah, all that stuff is, he looks at me as a Körper, not as a Leib. Although he, if he's a good doctor, he also will ask me how I'm doing, Okay, so for Husserl, it is only the phenomenological reduction that gives us access to the Leib, to the body as a Leib, as a lived body, as if you will, transcendental condition of the possibility for experiencing the world. So first of all, Husserl would say only the reduction gives us access to the body as a Leib, as an organ that functions in the world. And that is the condition of the possibility for having experience of the world, right? So it's a transcendental, it's the body, the Leib is a transcendental condition of possibility for experiencing the world for Husserl. And when Merleau-Ponty says it can never be complete, what he means by that, I think, is something else. He means by that this phenomenology should not be a merely reflective activity. It should not just be an armchair activity, if you will. And so in that sense, I don't see him as contradicting Husserl at all. I think he just emphasizes something very different. And that is the fact that we can never stay in the phenomenological attitude, but we must return to the natural attitude as well. And of course, that's what we do. The moment I get out of this office and I make coffee or cast a vote when I go to the elections, I am, of course, back in the natural attitude. And then phenomenology helps me very, 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 very little, if not nothing at all, to help me decide which party I'm going to vote for.
Thank you very much for this fascinating answer to the important question. And now, Lena, will you ask the question?
Yeah, thank you. That was a great pleasure to hear from you about phenomenology. And my question is dedicated to social ontology. And you said that social ontology is primarily working with traditional texts of phenomenology, Husserl's, for example, Heidegger, I think. And what social ontology thinks about interpersivity? Because some of Husserl's, I think, students or other philosophers said that interpersivity is a little bit about solipsism, but social ontology thinks about conditioned subjects that are living together, and what so on they think about interpersivity. So that's my question.
Interpassivity, was that the term?
From Husserl.
Was the term passivity? I didn't understand.
Interpersivity.
Intersubjectivity, you mean?
Oh yes, I think so.
Okay,
yes.
Okay. Well, so yeah, thank you. I think the idea is quite simple. The idea is that Husserl starts out by describing intentional acts and the way we experience, a tree as opposed to a melody and so on. And so it seems, and from the very beginning, people have said, well, this disregards or leaves out the whole social dimension of the human being, right? I mean, so it's never that we just see a tree. I mean, the tree, just to say something like, to see a tree means to see a tree in a forest, and a forest has a certain meaning for me, right? So to say it in Husserl's later terminology, the tree is also part of my life world. It's not just some isolated phenomenon, right? And so, Husserl had to sort of explain himself by saying, well, no, that's not what I mean. Of course, what I'm doing here is I'm isolating, isolating certain phenomena, describing them discretely. But of course, much more fundamental is the fact that we are in the world, as Heidegger would say, and being in the world means being with others, and these others are not just part of my perceptual field, but of course, in terms of my making sense of the world. I can make sense of the world only because of the things that I learned, the books that I've read, the people I've interacted with. And so it's sort of, Husserl starts out from the individual things and then makes his way to the social. And that's maybe unfortunate because phenomenology always has to study, consciousness as consciousness with others, right? So this talk of me, myself, is a very limited way of speaking, right? So social ontology is ultimately where phenomenology must go if it is to be in any way an account of our experience of the world. Yeah.
Other questions? If you are still formulating your questions, I would like to ask a question too. Dear Professor Luft, how do you think? Do we have something analogous to the natural attitude in the domain of ethics? So Husserl, in his late manuscripts, he only mentions a praktische Generalthesis, but it is not that much from the domain of ethics. It's rather from the domain of hedonistic life. Man kann doch leben. The life is still worth living. So it's not really an analogous thing to the natural attitude for the ethical behavior. Can we find something analogous for the ethical behavior? So you mentioned in the previous answer that the phenomenology doesn't help us to choose a party to vote for, and doesn't help us to make a coffee. Could it help us to find a better ethical decision?
Not as phenomenology. Okay, so if you read these later texts, and one part of one corpus is the Kaitso articles, the articles that Husserl published in the Japanese journal Kaitso. The issue becomes different. So in the late texts, he speaks about the renewal of human life, right? And of course, he's writing this after World War I, where Western civilization or the global civilization seems to have gone bust. World war means that everybody fights everybody. How is this possible in a life of culture and so on? So humanity as a whole has just seriously derailed itself, right? Is his analysis. We're in crisis. And of course, Husserl was not the only one to talk about humanity in crisis. Many people were, of course, right? So he then has the idea that humanity as such must realign itself, right? And of course, starting with the individual. And so in the Kaitzer article, he speaks of an ethical epoche, right? So the idea is sort of the problem sort of turns itself around. So what is more fundamental for Husserl, for like everybody of us, is that once in a lifetime, we should practice an epoche from our previous self, right? Bracket it, think and reflect about what we want to be individually, right? So what do I really want from life? What do I really want to be, right? What kind of a person do I want to be? And then to, construct, as it were, this new self and then try to live by it. And I think that's more fundamental than the phenomenological epoche, right? The phenomenological epoche is an epistemological device, method to get clear about what philosophy should be. But more fundamental, much more fundamental, is the ethical epoche, right? So does phenomenology help me cast a vote? No, but the ethical epoche should, right? The ethical epoche should help me realign myself and say, okay, now, my whole life I've been raised in a socialist household. My father, my mother, everybody was socialists, and I just sort of went along and just voted for the Socialist Party all my life just because that's what everybody in my family did. And then I asked myself, do I really believe in this party's vision or not? And then, I reflect and say, well, actually, I don't. I mean, I've just been going along. I mean, this is sort of inauthentic existence in Heidegger, like uneigentlich. I'm just doing what everybody told me. And I just went along with it. And now I realign, I understand that I really am not a socialist. I really don't want to vote for this party. And I shouldn't, because of my belief, my deepest beliefs that I formed myself. And of course, I have to give myself account for the logon didona. I have to explain to myself, what are the arguments for my belief, right? Not just a gut feeling. And then I say, well, it turns out after this ethical epoche, I'm never going to vote for the Socialist Party again because it doesn't align with my beliefs. That would be a way in which an ethical reflection can shape my practical decisions, but not philosophy. Not philosophy. I mean, Husserl says himself in the Cartesian Meditation, philosophy can change, or phenomenology as a form of philosophy, changes nothing about the normal world. So I see phenomenology as a very technical device in the domain of theoretical philosophy. And practical life is something very different. So only by analogy can something like an ethical epoche help me make my decisions, but phenomenology can't help me at all when it comes to politics or ethics, I think. Might be disappointing.
Thank you.
I hope I don't disappoint you, but.
No. I'm really interested to work on this question. Thank you. So any other remarks or questions?
I see Mikhail.
Yeah.
See Mikhail Belousov here. So maybe Mikhail wants to ask a question.
Professor Luft, thank you very much for the very interesting lecture. I just have a small special question considering the role of adumbrations in the audio experience, in the audio perception. Using an example with melody, you said that there is no adumbrations in audio experience for Husserl, but I think in Ideas 1, Husserl using an example with tune of violin and opposing this experience of tune to the absolute experience of consciousness, says ein Gageton dagegen mit seiner objektiven Identität ist durch Abschattung gegeben. Hat seine wechselnden Erscheinungsweisen, die sind andere, je nachdem ich mich der Geige nähe oder von ihr entferne. Je nachdem im Konzertsaal selbst bin oder durch die geschlossenen Türen hindurch höre und so weiter. So can we still say that for Husserl there are adumbrations in this kind of.
Yeah, but different, right? But essentially different than in visual perception, right? So yeah, I didn't mean to say there are no adumbrations in the auditory field, but they're just very different, right?
Okay.
I mean, the point here that the example that, or the quotes that you were giving, what he wants to show there is that there's different types of adumbrations in visual and auditory, right? So in the case of the melody, it's louder or less loud, right? Here through a door, or here, like right here, the radio, if the radio is right here, right? Is a form of adumbrations, but that's fundamentally different from the adumbrations of co-intending the backside of a three-dimensional object. So yes, you're right. I mean, you're right to point this out, but I would defend Husserl or myself by saying what he wants to point out is that there are, again, sui generis differences in forms of experience that merit their own investigation. That's I think the point he's trying to make here. So you're right about the example, but I think what he means to say is the larger point, right? That different forms of consciousness have different forms of adumbrations, right? I mean, some don't have adumbrations at all, right? So the memory of me having coffee with my friend yesterday has no backside, right? I mean, the coffee cup in my memory has a backside, but not my memory of the coffee cup has no backside, right? So, right? Those are classical examples that he uses.
Thank you.
Good. Yeah, thank you. Spasiba.
Other questions? Please, we still have some time. You can still ask questions. Veronica Chibataro, please, your question.
Yes, thank you very much for this very interesting talk. I would have a question concerning the relationship between phenomenology and psychology. Perhaps you already talked about this in the beginning of your talk because I came later. I know that there is a doxa in phenomenology that phenomenology is not psychology, and Husserl, he insists a lot that he's against psychologism, but at the same time, in some of his texts, he speaks about phenomenology as a form of psychology. So it seems to me that there is something ambiguous, perhaps, in Husserl concerning this relationship between phenomenology and psychology. But it seems to me also very important to understand the difference between these two disciplines, because he always says that phenomenology is not psychologism. Yes. So could you perhaps explain how do you see the relationship and the distinction between phenomenology and psychology?
Yeah. Okay. Very good question. I mean, the main difference straight away is that psychology is an empirical science of the soul of the creature, human being, or perhaps of a certain animal, right? I mean, if you study psychology of gorillas and chimpanzees, that's also a form of psychology, but it's an empirical discipline of a creature that we define, right? Human being, animal, you know, consciousness of parrots, birds, you know, that's an empirical discipline. Phenomenology is an eidetic a priori science. That's the main difference. But there, of course, are analogies. I mean, it's also that psychologists also describe perception, right? As does the phenomenologist. So there is this analogy in that phenomenology also describes forms of consciousness that psychologists also might describe. So that's the analogy. But then the disanalogy, again, is that for phenomenology, the psyche is just an isolated phenomenon of experience, that consciousness is much more, right? Again, I mentioned the body, right? The lived body, right? The body that right now is the executor of my will when I grasp something, right? So the body is an organ as a tool by which I interact in the world is not something that psychology would study, right? So psychology would study a certain layer of consciousness, namely pure, consciousness, as it were, and not other phenomena such as consciousness as necessarily embodied in a lived body. That's not something that psychology would study. And that's why for Husserl, ultimately, psychology is also a paradoxical discipline, because it does not understand itself correctly, right? And that's what he calls the paradox of subjectivity, right? That psychology does not understand that consciousness is at the same time a phenomenon in the world and the experience that has the world, right? So that is the paradox that only phenomenology can solve, by seeing that there's two ways of talking about the subject as a being in the world and a subject for the world. So that's the difference, right? But again, the main difference, like straight away, is just to say psychology is an empirical science. Phenomenology uses, right? We use our own psyche as access to phenomenological description, but our own psyche is just an example, right? So phenomenology must not remain empirical. Phenomenology must strive to describe eidetic a priori traits of something like perception. And take something like, if we study different creatures in their consciousness and their perception, we also have to say that other animals can also only experience things from the front side with the back side hidden. Even an insect with, its complex eyes, right, the facets eyes, also can only see things in adumbrations. So that would be an eidetic law. Phenomenology is interested only in eidetic laws, and psychology is interested in particular individual species, and perhaps also these species pathologies, right? So psychopathology, right, that studies mental illnesses or mental disabilities, for example, or aberrations from the norm, is of course a very important study, but it studies consciousness of a certain species in the way it has become sick, right, or ill or abnormal, right? So Husserl realized that something like psychopathology is very important. And psychopathology can also use the phenomenological insights like first-person access, empathy, and so on, but it's a fundamentally empirical discipline, as opposed to phenomenology, which is supposed to be pure, a pure a priori discipline. Yeah?
Yes, but can I a bit go on? Yes, I know that this distinction is very important for Husserl, even if sometimes I think that he's a bit ambiguous on this distinction. But I'm almost ashamed to say it, but sincerely, I've never really understood fully this distinction, even if I know that it's absolutely essential for it's the first thing that you learn when you learn phenomenology, that it's not psychology, it's against psychology, and so on and so on. It's not an empirical science. But to come back to your example of adumbrations, but for example, couldn't we imagine that there is some kind of psychological science which also comes to the conclusion that that all species perceive through adumbration, and we could call this a kind of general empirical law of perception? And then what would be the distinction then between this eidetic law of adumbration and this universal, so to say, empirical law of psychology?
Okay, yeah, that's you're making it. Yeah, good question. Yeah, you're right. Husserl is ambiguous ultimately. He also says that there is a phenomenological psychology. Right? The one discipline within phenomenology is phenomenological psychology. So first of all, psychologism. Since you mentioned it, right? Psychologism is the belief that psychological laws can be reduced to the species human being, and that's psychologism. That's reductive. That's reductive naturalism, if you will, if you use contemporary terminology, and that has to be dismissed, right? So phenomenology never talks about individual species, but always tries to make general claims. Now, your point was, what about psychologists studying different species come together and find general psychological laws that obtain for all species Okay. It would be a generality, an empirical generality. That would be Husserl's answer. And generality is not universality. So, right, that's a fundamental distinction in philosophy, right? I mean, we can have empirical generality, and Husserl would say that's still not at the gold standard, so to speak, for Husserl. The gold standard has to be a priori. And the difference between generality and universality is a matter not of degrees, but a matter of principle, right? And so what he thinks he can do, what phenomenology must do, is practice the eidetic variation. As you know, variation gets us to universal laws and not just a higher level of generality. Now, that's the plan, that's the idea. But where can we really, I mean, I'm very critical of the eidetic project, to be quite, I mean, I'm with you in criticizing it, right? Because ultimately, I think pure phenomenology, the way he envisions it, is actually a very, very small discipline. We can have very, very few truly a priori laws with respect to consciousness. The generality is much more interesting, right? So I find exactly, I mean, if you, so I mean, take something like culture as another study of not psychology, but no, I mean, I study philosophy of culture as well, right? So I'm not a cultural relativist completely, but we can find certain human traits, let's call them cultural, across all cultures, right? Language, technology, cognition. I mean, these are symbolic forms that Cassirer talks about. And for Cassirer, I mean, he would never say this is a priori, right? It's transcendental insofar as we're talking about the condition of the possibility of experiencing the world as a cultural world, but that's just all that we can get if we want to say anything interesting and not completely arid a priori. Concerns really only generalities. And I would be perfectly happy with that. But that's not Husserl's, right? Husserl wants one step further, right? You have, I mean, do you have a response? Please go.
No, I don't. I understand what you say, and I think that's exactly what Husserl would say. And
Yeah.
if I remember well, he also says at the moment that finally the results of psychology and of phenomenology are the same. It's just that the method is different. And but this is. I must confess that this is a bit frustrating for me, because then I think if the method is so different, because Husserl insists a lot on this revolutionary almost method of phenomenology, and finally we arrive at more or less the same results as psychology. Yes. Yeah. Well, then yes. Why? Perhaps
again, I mean,
my question, but then why to adopt this new method?
Well, Husserl would say it's also a revolution in the way we see the world, and that's the Copernican turn, right? So he would say there's a truly philosophical insight here that psychologists are missing because they do not practice the reduction. That's the difference, right? So the break with the natural attitude, this breaking through to the new dimension, philosophy as transcendental philosophy in the sense of Kant, that's not some, that's the truly philosophical insight that the psychologist is missing, even if they are arriving at the same results. So they're missing the philosophical dimension, Husserl would say. And by the way, someone like Zahavi says that too, right? I mean, Zahavi agrees here with Husserl. He says, yeah, there's something like the truly philosophical dimension of these insights are missing if you remain at the level of psychology. Although again, the results might be quite analogous or even completely analogous.
Yes, and here perhaps I would like to add something and to come back to what Gheorghiem Черnavin said about this ethical reduction. Then perhaps that the interest and the importance of the transcendental reduction is that it has an ethical dimension also, which sciences lack, I don't know, you probably know Emmanuel Lucet, and he has a very interesting interpretation. And he says that actually through the transcendental reduction, we become aware of our responsibility for the world. Yeah. So perhaps there also, this would be also an important point to understand what is actually the importance of this, yes, of a phenomenological method.
Yeah, but I find I know this interpretation. I find this responsibility rather nebulous, rather vague. So I'm not very convinced. I mean, if phenomenology makes us more reflective in this general way, and one part of reflection lets us see that we're responsible, I find that very, 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 very little. Yeah, no. I mean, let me get back to the point. I mean, so. I mean, take Korsgaard's interpretation of Kant. She uses this language of responsibility, right? And that the way she interprets Kant's ethics is to say the Kantian insight, the truly great Kantian insight, is that freedom and responsibility belong together, that we're responsible for what we ourselves have stipulated for ourselves. And that's her interpretation of the categorical imperative, right? We are beholden to something that is not a law of nature, but what we ourselves stipulate, and that we ourselves are stipulating because of that we are beholden and responsible for it, and that is true autonomy. I don't see anything in phenomenology resembling that, right? That we would somehow stipulate for ourselves laws of action, right? I mean, Husserl has an ethics, as you know, where he talked the early ethics, where he has this categorical imperative, right? Do the right thing in the situation, which I think is the attempt to expand Kant's formalism into a material ethics, right? The way in which Scheler attempted the same thing in different ways. Well, first of all, he never pursues that. I mean, it's sort of it's just an idea that he has and he never develops. And I also don't see how it would be feasible, right? So the idea, but does the categorical imperative that he formulates in his early ethics have anything to do with phenomenology in the way he talks about it later in terms of reduction? And I don't see a connection, to be quite honest. Maybe you do. Tell me.
No, not directly. Perhaps the only thing which there is like an adage is this what Dominique Pradel he calls this theoretical primacy of reason in Husserl, and you see this in his early writings on ethics, that finally the ethical reason is somehow reduced to theoretical reason. And this is, for example, what Dominique Pradel says, and I quite agree with him from this point of view. And this is perhaps something that you find generally in the earlier writings of Husserl. So this is perhaps the link that I would make. But then in his later writings, he also says a lot of things about the norms, and also about the exigence to reconstruct the world according to the true norms. And perhaps here there is something more interesting in Husserl ethics.
But where do the norms come from, right? I mean, are they up in the sky? I mean, are they Platonic entities? What are they?
Well, I guess they are norms of the reason.
Theoretical or practical?
I think it is bound in Husserl. I don't think he makes radical distinction like Kant, for example, between these two types of reasons. Yeah, I don't know. That's just my opinion. I don't know. Perhaps Gheorghe Черnavinin has to add something on this.
Yes. Yeah. Frankly speaking, I had another question, but we are working for 80 minutes for this moment. So if Professor Luft permits me, I will ask a question, but not on ethical questions.
Because the question was, where do norms come from?
Yes. So I would like to add something. You mentioned that you see. No, I don't have a position here.
You're gone.
Sorry, it was my connection, which is not great. And yeah, unfortunately, I don't have a good idea on norms, but yes. You still hear me, colleagues?
Yes, yes.
Yes. Yeah. But yeah, if you would like to add something to this discussion.
Well, I have to think about the issue of norms. Honestly, I don't have a good worked out answer. I just never took the Husserlian ethics very seriously, honestly. I find it an interesting idea, but not fully executed well. And again, I mean, I don't think, when it comes to ethics, I don't think phenomenology has much to say, to be very provocative. Right, Veronica? Sorry to disappoint.
Yes, but then it's a problem, because how can be phenomenology prima philosophia when it doesn't have any satisfactory ethics? Then it's just it cannot be a fundamental philosophical discipline. What was
I completely agree. That's why, I mean, just because I talked about phenomenology as first philosophy doesn't mean I believe that. I don't believe in it. I mean, I was just laying out the plan, laying out the landscape. But that's for me the least plausible, least persuasive part of Husserl's philosophy. I must be quite honest. I've become a pragmatist. I don't know if I told you this. Some dirty secret. I'm a pragmatist. I don't believe in any of this first philosophy stuff. I can tell you about it, but I don't believe in it. Is that okay?
Yes, actually, I think that Marc Richer, because Gheorghiu Черnavinin, he works on a lot on Marc Richer, and he has a group about Marc Richer. He also said in one of his interviews that that was really the part of Husserl that was the less convincing for him, the ethics.
Yeah, I don't know Richer at all, but if we agree on this, yes, well, peace be with him.
Yeah, I'm in a difficult situation because I'm supposed to be the moderator, but I deadly want to ask a question, but our time is over. So may I ask, wouldn't it bother you, Professor? Yes. So I would like to ask a question on one of the points that you mentioned. Namely that the split between analytical philosophy and phenomenology now is softening. Namely, phenomenology and analytical philosophy from the beginning, they had a specific relation to trivial sentences, on trivial facts. And when we think about Husserl, I'm in the garden, children are playing here, I can hear them, I'm under the tree, or my manuscript, and so on. And nearly all them, so a great number of manuscripts starts with, I am a human being, I have a living body, I am in the world, and so on. And within the analytical tradition, this sense for triviality is also present. So George Edward Moore would say, this is my hands, and that's why the world exists. Wittgenstein would also recite trivial facts in order to go to the important stuff. And when their boundary between analytical philosophy and phenomenology is softening, does this mean? I think that phenomenologists mention those trivialities in order to show the abyss of their problematicity of the constitution, which is behind the triviality. Wittgenstein would say, actually, the answer to the so-called philosophical question is a triviality. It is only difficult to find the right triviality. So my question would be, when now phenomenology and analytical philosophy are coming closer together, does it mean that it works in both ways? So that not only a phenomenologist will function in a mode comparable with Wittgenstein, contemplating the trivialities and giving trivial answers to the trivial questions, but also analytical philosopher will also start to see the abyss of the sense constitution behind the trivial. Sorry for the long question.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to compare phenomenology and analytic philosophy, you have to ask what phenomenology, what analytic philosophy, what do you, I mean, those are such very general terms. But I mean, I would agree with you. Yes, I mean, there's a very phenomenological element in the late Wittgenstein, at least, right? You know, that he said also this emphasis on showing, not explaining, zeigen. You know, I mean, just point to something. And he also has these texts where Wittgenstein talks about pure seeing. You know, that we just have to learn how to see correctly. And if you will, you can compare that also with Heidegger's late philosophy. This attempt of Gelassenheit. You know, that just to, which again, I mean, Gelassenheit doesn't mean just to stop doing something, but also is also a stance that we have to learn once we unlearn Western metaphysical thinking, right? I mean, so for Heidegger too, this would be something that is an achievement that we have to learn. So in that sense, I would agree, yes, between Wittgenstein, you mentioned Ayer, Husserl, and Heidegger in this sense. The triviality is an interesting point. I mean, could one say that Husserl is trying to explain the trivialities of the natural attitude? In a certain sense, one could, I guess, could say that. I mean, that things that we take for trivial in the natural attitude become a problem in phenomenology. And that's the whole idea of the break with the natural attitude, that we have to learn to see trivialities as non-trivialities, as problems to be solved, right? In this sense, there is an analogy, but the disanalogy would again be that for Wittgenstein, I mean, I'm no Wittgenstein expert, but from what I understand, that once we see that the task of philosophy is just to show that all philosophical problems are nothing but trivialities when we understand that they're just linguistic confusions. And I don't think Husserl would agree with that, right? With the idea of explaining trivialities, in other words, problematizing things that in the natural attitude we take for granted, in this sense, yes. Not in the sense if in Wittgenstein that philosophy then would be shown to be obsolete when we understand trivialities as linguistic confusions. That would not be Husserl's, and I don't think Heidegger's either conviction. Does that make sense?
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. And we are really abusing the time, so the moderator is guilty here. Thank you very much, Professor Luft, for the fascinating talk, and everyone for the discussion.
Yeah, if
yes.
you have any questions,
and, now,
feel free to send me an email.
As a performative, I would say that it's over, and thank you very much for the talk and for the discussion.
Spasiba.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Спасибо всем. До свидания.
Yeah.
До свидания.